So we've got cold weather here this morning in North Carolina. It was 32 degrees this morning, but we put a jerkbait on and we got out here in some of these ditches and these drains, and we've just commenced to catching them. It seems like that colder water has them fired up. That water temp's 50 degrees. So we're going to talk about everything you need to know about fishing a jerkbait right now and how to catch more fish with it. So stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss this video. So real quick, I'm going to show you guys how I go about actually fishing a jerkbait, because I feel like a lot of people don't utilize it the right way. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cast out here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reel that bait down till I get to my pretty much max depth with it. And then the key is pointing that rod back at it. And so one of the biggest misconceptions is you only move the jerkbait with the rod with a twitch motion, and then you reel up your slack and continue on with that. But what we've learned with the use of pan optics over here is that that jerkbait can create so much more action if you twitch it a little bit faster, reel it a little bit, jerk it. And it really changes the game when you watch these fish actually chase it, because you can sit there and put all of these different twitches and motions into it to really get these fish to trigger. You know, if I cast it out and a fish is behind it, I might double twitch it, I might single twitch it, I might pause it, I might reel it real quick. If those fish are really, really charged up and they're chasing right up after it, sometimes you can reel it, jerk it, and they'll just rip the rod out of your hand. But for those of you guys that don't have forward-facing sonar, a good rule of thumb is twitch, twitch, and I point back at it, another twitch, and you see where my rod tip meets the water, there's a bow in my line. I have slack in that, and so what that does is that gets that jerkbait to go back and forth without having to move it forward or backward too much. So the first thing that everybody thinks about when they pick up a jerkbait is going to be how to make it suspend perfectly. But what if I told you that's not necessarily the answer that you're looking for? Because a jerkbait is pretty much limited to about 12 feet and less, we'll say right out of the package, right? What you can also do is weight your jerkbaits to make them sink. As you'll notice on the bottom side of this jerkbait, I've put a suspend strip on the bottom. And in this case, it's to make it perfectly suspend because of how I'm fishing it. But you can also overweight these baits. And that's something that people completely underutilize, is how deep you can actually fish a jerkbait. And that's really been a player with forward-facing sonar. And don't worry, you guys that don't have forward-facing sonar, I'm going to talk about how to fish a jerkbait without forward-facing sonar, but I'm going to stick with how to utilize it more with forward-facing sonar to begin with. So there's a few different ways you can go about weighting a jerkbait. You can do it with the suspend strips like I alluded to earlier. You can also do it with the hooks. You can upsize the hooks on a bait, all three of them back to, and when you weight those hooks, what you do is you get a natural fall rate, but you get a slower sinking fall rate, and you can speed it up depending on the size hooks that you put on it. So you can really start to fish this bait over deeper water. And you might ask why that's kind of important. Well, when you get into this time of year, you get into fish that are living in deeper brush piles, you get into fish that are schooling in deeper water, and honestly, if you're looking at them with forward-facing sonar and they're sitting on a particular piece of cover or they're suspended over something, sometimes triggering them on a jerkbait is just the absolute best way to do it. And if you watch when I work one of these jerkbaits, you can see that I'm actually watching the fish and I'm watching my jerkbait to see how those fish are reacting to it. So you can see I pause it a little bit. If those fish see it from a further distance away, I like to give them a chance to get up on it. And so right there, that fish is right on it, and there I hooked that fish right there. But what you see, it's actually a pretty big spotted bass, but what you see is it actually took me a minute to let that fish come up on it, get a little bit closer to it, and then let the fish get a chance to get close enough to it before I started working the bait, where I made that jerkbait look almost nervous. And then I think I actually break this fish off when it's sitting there flopping around. But yeah, right there I break that fish off, and then I try to get it with my rod. But you can see I try to give those fish an opportunity to get close to that bait, and then I move it a little bit faster the closer it gets to it, to try to play cat and mouse with it to the point where it gets almost irritated that it can't catch it. And that's why I start to speed it up a little bit right there as you see that fish get closer to it, and that's ultimately what led to me hooking that fish. So changing that retrieve is something that I don't see guys do nearly enough. I just see guys twitch it once and over again, because after a few casts, if you're not getting bit, it seems like you kind of fall into that groove, right? And that's kind of what forward-facing sonar has showed us, is that if you fall into that groove, those fish really get uninterested. So for those of you guys that don't have forward-facing sonar, when you make a cast, utilize it just how I just did in that short clip where I was actually showing you with my rod, because if you utilize it like that, where you're actually twitching that bait, reeling it a little bit, twitching it a little bit more, you can kind of gauge those fish's reactions, and then you can start Then you can kind of start to put a pattern together for yourself with how you work that bait. If you notice every time you get them on that double pump or that single pump, then you can start to do more of that, but you really have to gauge those fish's reaction. The next thing is going to be where you fish a jerkbait. So when you're looking at your map, you can see the breakdown of a lake. Right here, we're on a small lake in North Carolina. And what you can see is these maps highlight the river channels for you. And that's going to be key when you're getting into this winter fishing period, is you want to fish places where that river channel is going to push up against. And that could be as simple as some of these points in this small pocket, but you see how that deep water comes right into there. So you're looking for places with deep water access this time of year. And that could be things like main lake points, that could be things like these small pockets, but it's all going to depend on where the bait fish are at on your specific fishery. So going through, finding the bait fish, and then finding where that deep water pushes up against it, because that's going to give those fish the ease to ambush that bait when it comes up. And it's also going to give those fish access to get the heck out of there if they get a cold front. And so that's what you really need to look for, is spend some time graphing, utilizing your fish finders, and figure out where that bait's at, because that's what's going to make your jerkbait the most effective, is fishing it around areas where the bait fish are frequenting. As far as jerkbaits and specific colors that I'm going to throw, there's really only a few colors. I really try to revolve around a natural shad presentation. Sometimes that might be white if you get a little bit windier conditions, a little bit more overcast, and then it might be all the way up into some natural color shads when you get the right nice overhead skies, a little bit sunnier conditions. That more translucent is going to play a little bit more for that. And so you can see on a few of these baits, I've changed the hooks out to give them different fall rates. And so that way, when I get on some fish, I don't actually have to go through and change the hooks as soon as I see a situation. I can just have some ready to go for when I run across these different situations. So that way I can just pick one up, tie it on, and fire it out there without really having to worry about what the hooks are going to make it do. And so I try to keep it standard across the board with the different hooks that I use. I'll have the exact hooks linked down below, so that way if you guys are looking for hooks for jerkbaits, I can kind of gauge you on some of the ones that I like, because we all know how often fish jump off on a jerkbait, but it's most of the time due to dull hooks or the wrong hooks that guys are throwing on jerkbaits. And so I'll have, again, my favorites linked down below, so that'll help you guys kind of have a better chance at landing some of these fish. Along with those hooks, I'll have some of the gear that I like to throw a jerkbait on linked down below, so that way you guys, if you're looking for a new combo, you can kind of break it down. But some of the things to go off of when you're trying to fish a jerkbait is you want to have a rod that is stiff enough to be able to work that jerkbait, but you also want to have a rod that is soft enough to be able to hook those fish and not pull the hooks out of those fish. And one thing that I really want to talk about with a jerkbait is when you're using your reel, I see all too often guys have their reels clinched down with the drag, and then they try to thumb the spool. And that might work for everything else, but when it comes to treble hook baits, I hate doing that, and I especially hate doing that with jerk baits. My buddy Jacob Bigelow and I played around with that a lot, fishing down in Florida, hooking really big fish that were taking drag. It works a lot better if you have your drag tightened down when you hook those fish, but then you back that drag off and let the drag of your reel system actually let the fish take line, because it's going to be a smoother pull and it's not going to pull the hooks out of those fish's face as opposed to thumbing it. I see guys do that way too often, and that's most often times why people lose fish on a jerkbait. The other thing that I want to talk about with hooks is going to be upgrading the hook size if you're around big fish. Because this time of year, those fish are getting really big, and you have the opportunity to catch some really big fish. So if you're on a lake that you honestly think you have legitimate shots at fish over 5 pounds, or you're consistently running into fish over 5 pounds, but you're losing them on a jerkbait, what I like to do is take the middle hook out and upgrade my 2 trebles, one in the front and one in the back, to a number 4. Because what that does is that gives that hook a wider gap, and it actually hooks those big fish better. Because when those fish get that big, oftentimes they're going to get the bait no matter what. And so that middle treble hook gives those fish a little bit of leverage. And what it also does is if you have to downsize, those fish will just nip it and it won't get around the bone in their jaw. And so that's why I upgrade to those 2 4s, because it makes a huge difference being able to land those fish and then having stiffer hooks to not bend your hooks out. So hopefully that helps you guys break down how to fish a jerkbait a little bit better, and how to utilize it, and how to put it in more places than you ever thought you were able to. Now what I want you guys to do is check out this video up here where I link to some of my favorite wintertime baits. It's going to be a jig and a Nico rig, and it's really going to help you guys break down a couple different baits to add to your arsenal, and why people catch fish on a jig versus when to use a Senko or something like that, especially when you're fishing docks in the wintertime. So go ahead and check that video out. Give that So go ahead and check that video out. I think you'll learn a lot from that video, but thank you guys so much for watching. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.